When people think of folklore, urban legends, a lot of times the last thing on their mind is the southern United States. Many people will think of Sleepy Hollow or somewhere in the New England area where the majority of like Stephen King books take place, but they never think of somewhere like South Carolina. But the small southern state has a ton of lore. Actually, South Carolina is one of the places where people claim to see Bigfoot the most in the southern United States, and also one of the places where it's easier to have a UFO sighting. For every 100,000 people, there are about 600 UFO sightings. And don't even get me started on the Boohag. If you know, you know. But South Carolina is home to one of the most haunted buildings in America. And people call it haunted because it used to be an insane asylum. And we'll be talking about the Babcock Insane Asylum on today's episode of Learn Something New Today. In 1858, the Babcock building began construction, and it was designed by George E. Walker. Now, Walker passed away before the building could even finish completion. But the entire building was built in 1821, and it was called the South Carolina Lunatic Asylum. The portion that we're going to be talking about is specifically the portion that was built in the 1850s. Now, this insane asylum or building facility that housed mentally unwell people was built well before slaves were emancipated. The building catered mostly to paying white patients, although some slaves that were deemed mentally incapacitated were allowed to be there. Although there's very little evidence to show who actually physically built the building, there is some idea that slaves were used in the construction of the lunatic and insane asylum. And after the construction of the facility, thousands of people flocked to get professional treatment. And shortly after the Civil War, the insane asylum was renamed the South Carolina State Hospital. After it was renamed, it originally started catering to only wealthy people, charging the equivalent of $250 per day to stay there. And if you wanted a separate eating area, you were charged an additional $100. If you're rich, you can't be around those crazy poor people, even if you're crazy yourself. The state did have a program for people that were considered indigent, which means they couldn't take care of themselves or they had no family, but they were mentally unwell. They would get charged $135 a year. Of course, the quality of the services you would receive at that level would substantially change. But as the hospital started accepting more and more poor patients, the cost of keeping them started becoming harder to collect from the state. On top of that, the patient population grew to about 200 people, more than they had originally anticipated. Patients began complaining about poor lighting, small rooms, narrow hallways, and flooding on the ground floor. It got to the point where many families saw how their relatives were living in the mental care facility and just took their relatives home or put them in the county jail. It got to the point where the state took over 100% of the responsibility from the private entity that ran the hospital. But at that point, the hospital's population had grown to over 1,000 people, and 30% of the patient population died every year at the mental hospital. That's 300 people every year that were dying at their hospital. In the early 1900s through like the 1930s, many Americans were dying of mysterious quote-unquote diseases like diarrhea, listeria, cholera, things like that. And the mental health facilities were used to warehouse people. So you had people that had physical illnesses like cholera and listeria housed in the same facilities as someone who had mental health issues. And mental health institutions like the South Carolina State Hospital became a warehouse for disease, where you had people that both needed legitimate care, but different types of care. By the mid-20th century, the hospital had changed a lot of its standards, and the superintendent pushed for outpatient clinics and programs to educate the public and families about mental illness. including its causes and methods of care, to try to prevent people from coming there and to handle more things at home. He even opened up traveling clinics that went throughout the state. By the 1950s, phenothiazine was discovered, and it was a substance that controlled many of the symptoms of mental illness. This allowed the hospital to open up its courts and allow patients to roam freely. Medicaid was also introduced around this time in the 1960s, along with other social welfare programs that helped spur a large-scale relocation of patients to community-based health centers instead of state-run hospitals. In 1964, the Department of Mental Health was created as an independent agency to assist South Carolina with research, mental health education, professional training, along with community services. But regardless of this, the hospital wasn't making many strides. The Department of Justice got involved and they wrote a report on the South Carolina State Hospital that said that the living conditions of the patients were flagrantly unconstitutional. They cited things like the cleanliness of the facilities, the lack of staff, the patients being just way too many. There were over 1,000 patients. They also cited that there were roach and rat infestations. Along with the continuous flooding, there was always flooding on the ground level. And because of that, people just didn't clean it. Remember, there wasn't enough staff to take care of everything that needed to be taken care of. So there was just stagnant water always there. The Department of Justice said that the remedy was to give them more funding. So they did just that. They gave them more money. But it didn't stop any of it. It just increased, and by the 1990s the wards that were in the Babcock building began shutting down completely, and soon entire floors began shutting down and were abandoned until the entire building was abandoned. The building sat in disrepair and abandoned up until 2018, when Columbia Fire Department responded to a fire there. When they investigated the fire, they found that the roof had been set on fire, but there was no fingerprints or any evidence to show someone did it. But they did say that it was arson. The same thing happened in 2020 as well. It was a second fire. This time it was much worse. Firefighters arrived early on Saturday morning to the Babcock building. The 3-alarm fire burned through the building's roof, causing the iconic dome to collapse on fire. The fire also caused massive structural damage to the building itself, and it just sat after that for years. And today, as of the recording of this podcast, it has been renovated and turned into apartment buildings. But this is what people are having to say about their experience living there. According to a Reddit forum of people that live in the neighborhood and people that live in the building, this is what they're saying. I was one of the workers that renovated the Babcock building doing the HVAC. The whole time, there would be weird electrical things not working and sounds of doors slamming and knocking on the walls when we worked overtime and night came. Once a new guy we were working with said he saw a man in old-timey clothes look at him, then go through a doorway. When he disappeared, he wouldn't work in Babcock late at night anymore after that. There's something there. I'd say before that you were crazy to think ghosts were something, but now I don't know what to think. The more the project went on, the less those things happened. So much so that I forgot about the things happening till you brought it up, since all this happened like a year or so ago. I'm a fairly rational person, but I wouldn't live there. Just seems to me some places hold the weight of significant emotional, physical trauma, and some people seem more sensitive to that element than others. Could be more of a suggestion, could be something we haven't become attuned to yet. And there was pure horror in that hospital for decades. I grew up down the street from there. At night, you could hear people screaming and somebody playing a piano. You could hear slamming doors all night. During the day, you would hear nothing, but at night, that's when everything seemed to come alive. When I was younger, friends and I used to take drugs and go there. I don't know if it was the drugs or if it was really ghosts, but there's a lot of weird shit that happens there at night. Lifelong South Carolinian here. I remember an exhibit at the State Museum years ago when I was a kid about Bull Street that scared the fool out of me. Electroshock therapy, hydrotherapy, people chained to the walls. You couldn't pay me to stay a night in there, much less pay someone for the privilege. The general consensus to the apartment complex is like there's a resounding something going on in there. Now, whether you would live there is completely up to you. Personally, I wouldn't. I did look at the apartment complexes online, and they're actually really, really beautiful, which almost changed my mind if I hadn't known the history of the actual facility. But with that being said, what would you do? Would you live there? Answer the question in the question, the poll at the end. Oh, lost my train of thought there. But that's our podcast for today of Learn Something New Today. I'm your host, Antonio Modesto Milian. And if you want to support this podcast, please feel free to leave a review, a 5-star review, please. And also you could purchase things from our merch store. You can actually support us on Patreon. It is your world. I'm just here to borrow a slice. Thank you guys again for allowing me to create this for you and for listening. My name is Anthony Modesto Milian, and stay safe and take care of each other.